Hi, Tim.
Hi, Payten.
Welcome. It's great to have you. I'm going to welcome you to our first episode of your residence here on Agile Live at Coding Temple. Before we begin, I'll do a brief introduction of myself. I'm Payten, and I'm with the B2B partnerships team at Coding Temple. But today I am your host. However, I won't take up too much of your time because we do have an incredible expert joining us, Tim Alvis. It is my pleasure to introduce Tim Alvis, and I'm going to go through your bio here, even though sometimes it's a little awkward. I feel like it's always a good idea to give yourself a moment to, sit in revel in your excellence. So Tim Alvis is a visionary chief product and technology officer with a 15-year track record in building, maturing, and scaling high-performance teams. His entrepreneurial spirit is evident in recent leadership through a $1.25 billion plus exit at Spins, where he played a key role in a $1 billion exit, managing $100 million in yearly revenue. His strategic leadership led to the successful launch of multiple products when achieved $1 million in revenue within 12 months. Timothy's journey includes impactful roles at Amazon and Microsoft, spearheading initiatives resulting in global programs and over $30 million in revenue. With a proven history of innovation and strategic thinking, Timothy Alvis is a dynamic force in the world of product and technology. So thanks for joining us, Tim. I'm going to pass it over to you.
All right. First, thank you. And yeah, that is awkward. Not the kind of words I typically say in association with myself, but thank you. So first, it's a pleasure to be invited. Love what Coding Temple is doing. Love what this series is supposed to be about, and hope that anyone who joins gets something out of the session. If you have any questions, I believe there's a way to pose those and get those in front of Payten that she can share. Share with me after, share with her as well. And with that, I'm going to go to the presentation. First thing to note is that we are learning as we go. This is the first time we've done this in this format. So forgive me if for any reason it feels like things are less than perfectly organized, because they probably are. So let me go to screen sharing here. All right. I believe everyone, yep, it looks like everyone can see. Great. So tech org velocity and precision in partnership with Coding Temple. First thing that starts off is, for most of you, probably feels like you're doing everything right. If you're interested in this session, this is probably not the first time you've come to attend a webinar or look through YouTube videos, read a book, read a blog article, anything at all to get better at building products that matter. But also for many, it just isn't working. At the start of the book, Competing with Luck, they have this great Yogi Berra quote, which is, we're lost, but we're making great time. And that's often how it feels whenever you have all the right processes, it seems, and everything is working as it sounds like it should, but yet outcomes aren't exactly what you need. So many companies, likely yours, there are people who are immensely talented, skilled, hardworking leaders. You know your discipline and your domain as well as anyone in the world. Every organization in the company has adopted the best-in-class frameworks, methodologies, processes. But one of the outcomes of that is, unless it's been done holistically as a result, probably each organization has a little bit of its own subculture, has its own way of thinking about your customers, the market, what's most important. Organizations then tend to disagree somewhat about priorities. And worst of all, you're not seeing results. One of the outcomes of that disagreement is, frankly, it becomes a negotiation on what is important. It's most often seen between sales, commercial, and product. And then product, sales, and commercial, and engineering. Engineering wants to take care of technical debt, or feels that some other challenge is really standing in the way and there just isn't time. How does this look if you sort of diagram it out? You have a product organization that is using user data says we should, our user data says our user research says we should. On the commercial side, it's like, look, we would have hit revenue if we had these features. A very important customer is going to leave if we don't have these features. And then on the C-level leadership side, we need to be doing this if we want to achieve our long-term vision, or we have a very important partner that just signed with our competitor because. And all of these things tend to come into this endless cycle of debate. And just as soon as you gain consensus, within 30 days, 45 days, 60 days, that consensus is again lost. If instead you work with a shared framework where everyone inside the company essentially agrees on how to think about how to approach the market with your products and go-to-market activities, you get out of some of that endless cycle of debate. Now, you still may have differences of opinion on the approach, but because you've been focused on with the same lens on what the problems are, you are much more, you're just faster, frankly. It takes a lot of that early part of the discussion out of it in terms of what's most important and why. It's really important, though, that that lens be lightweight. Can tell you I've seen many times, and I've been someone who's made this mistake as well. When you bring something that has tried to make everyone feel like you've included their subculture's method of prioritization and thinking and included it into something of a Frankenstein, that elaborate process always breaks down. It's too much time. It's too much focus on the process rather than the outcome, and people just frankly won't adapt. So if you're gonna make this kind of change, it really needs to start at the principles level, the how do we think about things. What does that look like when you're done? Everyone using the same framework means you have ranked customer pains and desires. You have guided rapid learning and you're doing it together. You've mapped the customer jobs and motivations. This one is extremely important when you're collaborating between commercial teams and product development and execution teams. And it's because if your product team doesn't have a deep and shared understanding of the customer problems you're trying to solve, how is the marketing team supposed to effectively communicate on that? If the marketing team is communicating on features or competitive lens, then you're gonna sort of miss the boat. I'm gonna answer this question here real quick. Is there a way you as a leader ensure everyone uses the same framework? Yeah, this is one that comes up a lot, especially in some of the direct consulting engagements. Like, okay, even if we agree right now, how do we get there? How does someone actually institute that kind of change? And I think the most important thing to know is, one, it won't be immediate. I talk about evil Knievel jumps and how they're bad planning. If your process is everyone adopts or we fail, that's sort of like you either jump across the canyon or you fall to the bottom and burn. You want to build a bridge in incremental steps, and the best way to do that is to show up with help. So, for example, one of the ways to get the commercial team and product team thinking about things the same way is to come at it from the perspective of, if we're going to build effective marketing messaging, we need to speak to people's pain. To speak to people's pain, we need to know what those pains and problems are. Now product and marketing are aligned in that research. So you come with help. You're like, hey, we can actually help tighten up the message. We're going to get a better conversion rate, and we're going to make better products. That also translates to sales. When it comes to sales, it's all right. If we take a minute and look at, we know that every deal matters, but every deal is within a whole. How do we look at the whole of what you're hearing and identify problems and pain that we're not solving effectively? How do we make sure that marketing is generating the right kind of leads? That way, when you come in, they are already thinking about what is important to them and how your product solves that pain or problem. So it takes time, it takes effort, but it starts with help. It definitely is not an evangelical, here is our new framework and how we're going to do things. Instead, it's much more around, here's what is important to us as a business. Here's how we can think about our customers. How do we apply that individually? Another thing on the competitive analysis front, everyone starts to get a shared understanding of how you fit in the market, what problems you solve, and what competitors solve similar problems. Market mapped opportunities, prioritized work, all of that stuff starts to come into alignment because people are thinking of and approaching that problem in the same way. Since this is about performance and velocity, there's something else to sort of consider, and that is the theater versus performance problem. So theater is work that appears to be important and useful, but ultimately provides little or no tangible value. You celebrate it for having been done rather than the impact that it actually delivers. Performance is work that has measurable improvements, and it can happen even if no one knows it's happening. So this isn't something that has to be seen to be felt. The impact is celebrated either way. One of the challenges that I've run into nearly every time I begin working with a company is that several popular frameworks have really excellent principles at their core, but the processes and the elaborate nature of how they have delivered those principles to the market for execution means that once they're put in practice, the processes become the measurement for success. Everyone, because of the complexity, it's like, wow, this took a lot of work to make sure that we're fully Scrum, fully safe, whatever it might be, or Kanban, like even Kanban, very simple setup. And suddenly this adherence to Scrum or type of Agile or safe or something like that becomes the actual measurement to determine whether we've achieved something. You start getting into a situation where I believe there's Scrum is a common example. Here's one example. I'll just kind of move to it. There are a bunch of Scrum events inside of Scrum. You have sprint planning, daily Scrum, sprint review, and the sprint retrospective. You have a lot of different Scrum roles. This used to be even more elaborate with pigs and chickens, and now it's been simplified a bit to product owners and Scrum masters. And you have artificial constraints. They actually place time on how long the sprint needs to be. And I'll give one working example of how this built in a ton of inefficiency for a company. So they were a startup. They're handling challenges that are really difficult to predict, outcomes that are really difficult to predict. And they were still going through this process. They would spend an hour and a half to 2 hours at the beginning of a sprint every 2 weeks planning. They would meet on their daily scrums. They would still at the end of the sprint do the 1 to 2.5, or 1.5 to 2 hour sprint review, and they would plan the sprint retrospective. But what was actually happening is there were also these other meetings during the week, whereas priorities changed as they learned something, or technology didn't work out the way that they needed it to, or a customer responded. Especially early days, your customers can be very influential when you're a startup leaning on revenue. They would change what content was inside the sprint, what they were actually trying to build. I know that that's sort of against the rules, but it's also a necessity very often. And even if you're in a more mature company, you may have stakeholders inside the company that have that ability to influence your timeline and your sprint midway through. So they were also now meeting to evaluate what to pull in and out of the sprint. At the end of the process, what we measured is that roughly half of what was in the sprint at the beginning was left in the sprint at the end. So about half of the work had been changed out and exchanged. And of that final body of work that resided when the sprint was planned to end, they still only had about a 70-ish% completion rate. So 30% of that sprint ended up rolling over. So the question became, what was the value in all of those meetings? Why were we spending that much time? How can we avoid these types of initiatives before it's too late? The key is looking at, first, when I talk about a shared framework, and we sort of reference it here a little bit later, for me, a framework needs to be process light and principle heavy. So it's a tool set for thinking rather than a set of processes. So the first is get rid of the idea of well-defined rituals like this. They become, again, that marker for performance. So let go of the idea that there's a set of processes and rituals that are going to get us through. Instead, think about, okay, based on what we know that we need to solve, if we're looking at these particular problems for customers and prioritizing our work to address the most important problems, the problems that will have the most impact for our customers, the rest of it can naturally flow out based on your own environment. There isn't really a one-size-fits-all. Different companies at different stages still. Like if you're doing a direct-to-consumer product, your iteration cycles are going to be much faster than they are going to be for a, say, enterprise level B2B product. And if you start getting into heavily regulated environments, it's probably going to slow you down even more. Your learning is going to have to look a little bit different. So the most important thing is realize what's key is being able to prioritize based off of what is important to customers, being able to flexibly reprioritize work as needed as you learn, and to get the fastest learning cycles possible. That's what's critical. Even if that learning cycle doesn't involve a build and release because the environment you're in doesn't allow that, find another way to get those learning cycles in. But the first thing I would typically do in any company is, let's not call ourselves a Scrum shop. Let's not call ourselves anything. Let's just talk about the work that we need to get done, what outcomes are we needing to achieve, and strip everything down to the least complex set of tools that get us there. The other thing is for Scrum roles, look at the roles that people play. If inside your small, especially if you're a small development team, like let's say you have less than 20 developers, if you have someone dedicated to just managing the backlog for 20 developers, like that is their full-time role, there's a problem. Like there is an efficiency problem. There is some work that's happening that looks important, but isn't actually generating value. So just stripping away, what are the decision points that are leading us to need someone to do this? What else could be happening? Not to mention the idea of a Scrum Master themselves. If you have someone whose role is literally defined by adhering to a process, that is also a problem. A process should not require someone who has a named role to facilitate and make sure it's adhered to. The best processes are invisible. They feel automatic. They feel like something that happens in the background on the way to an inevitable outcome. So yes, sprint planning for the most part is theater. Sprints also being 2 weeks, also largely theatrical. Not every feature fits in 2 weeks. Some things you can get done in 3 days, 5 days, and they're important. They should be released, especially in a continuous development environment. Some work requires more than 2 weeks. And I'll tell you one thing that ends up happening, and this is where we're just going to abuse the fact that we have 30 minutes and we can go wherever we want in this deck. I'm going to skip through to show this slide. Here we go. This is what happens in sprints. So what we think is going to happen when we have a 2-week sprint is this left side diagram. We are going to find the perfect body of work that completely takes up all the productive capacity of our engineering team for those 2 weeks, and we're going to get that done. What actually happens with a fixed length sprint is that because not everything fits in this way, it's not nicely shaped, it's different work, sometimes there are more unknowns than other, there's a ton of buffer. And so things get spread out in a way to where we feel like we're pretty sure we can get all of this done without question. And then it gets rearranged time and time and time again. Scala, which you see referenced here, is just a name we have applied to a small set of tools. It is process light. But the goal here is you really want to think of sprints more as milestones or releases. You want to think about what is the body of work that we're going to deliver that is valuable to customers, that customers will actually be impacted by, and set the period of time you're going to work on that based on that. Now, there are some constraints that provide value. Obviously, a 3-month sprint is not a valuable sprint. That's not a valuable body of work. You could have broken it up more than that. But something between a week and 6 weeks, yeah. Can theater feel like process? It almost always does. The biggest is to look at, we talked about that sprint planning process before. So if only 70% of 50% of the work that you defined at the beginning of the sprint process was completed, was the sprint planning valuable? Like, did you actually generate something? Sometimes there's some element to the sprint planning that was valuable. Like the most valuable part of sprint planning isn't actually defining what body of work fits into 2 weeks. It's choosing priorities. So you look at, the priorities were valuable. Knowing what is most important to work on, that's worthwhile. That had an impact that lasted. However, trying to fit it into 2 weeks and see what matched, that ended up taking up 75% of your time. So it's really getting everyone. Also, another way to make this work well is don't have it where someone is acting as auditor. Like if you're trying to bring efficiency, don't bring efficiency to someone. If you go at an engineering leader or a product leader or a commercial leader and try to bring a better framework, it's going to feel like you are stepping on their toes and telling them how to do their work. But if you work with them and say, hey, look, I'm not being nearly as efficient as I could be. I think it's part of this and how we're handling this part of the planning. Can we look at this together and see what happened? You'll have a lot more, you'll have a much higher likelihood of success. So with small principles in mind of rapid iteration, learning really quickly, customer outcomes being your North Star, that becomes a much better way to approach that planning process. I'm going to move back to where we were. Talk a little bit about artificial constraints. Another way to identify when something is theater versus when it's valuable is when is the constraint pointless? So if the consistency or definition aren't essential to achieving the desired outcome, it's probably an artificial constraint. So sprints being a fixed length of time, size and definition of a team. If your team is like, well, a team can only be 8 people. If it goes beyond 8 people, it becomes a tribe. And if it's more than, or a squad, and if it's more than 16 people, now we have to make it a tribe. Like, these are things that are not at all actually valuable to the outcomes. They may be helpful from an organizational perspective and good rules of thumb, but making them part of what you've achieved by like very finitely managing adherence to that, it's not really valuable. The amount of time to spend on daily scrums is 15 minutes better than 30. Should you plank while you do it? These are things that are theatrical, the frequency of other meetings, the topics that you're supposed to cover in certain meetings. The goal is to get rid of the idea that process is going to save what's going to happen and process is going to provide outcomes, and realize that processes are really executed principles when they're at their best, and therefore they tend to be light and flexible because the principles are what manage most. How do we manage a different opinion on what is or isn't a constraint, like an artificial constraint? A good way to have the conversation, if someone is open to it, if you're actually at that point where you've agreed on principles to where you're reevaluating together what it is you're trying to achieve with everything that you're doing internally as part of your process and your framework. The best question to ask is, for example, on sprints, if sprints were 3 weeks rather than 2 weeks, what would change? If they were 4 weeks rather than 2 weeks, what would change? 4 versus 3 or 2? If there isn't a great answer, or if the answer starts to become very self-referencing, you know it's probably artificial. Like, what would happen to a team if it's 10 people versus 8? What happens if rather than calling 2 teams of 8 a tribe versus a squad or just versus a team? Like, what changes there? Another way to identify them often is when you start getting into a lot of that special labeling. Any framework that suddenly comes up with a whole bunch of terminologies for things that are otherwise common, you should immediately be suspect. That's why the Spotify model and Scrum really stand out as like, there's probably an issue here. If you've taken common terms and redefined them, that's a challenge. There are helpful constraints and a way to recognize that. So for example, when writing a document on a product team, if you're writing a pitch, like an understanding, like they call them 6-pagers for a reason. If you're writing that document to describe why you're doing something and what that work looks like, and you allow it to go 40 pages, you're going to have meandering thought. You're going to have also a document that is way too dense for most people to even attempt to digest. By setting that constraint to something smaller, now you're forcing people to think differently and communicate differently. They're trying to wrap up that idea more succinctly, and there's value. Now, does it need to be 6 pages versus 8? No. The 6 number is artificial, but the constraint of making something concise and thoughtful is valuable. So finding that difference as well, where short is the goal, not 6 pages, keeps you from having someone spend a needless 3 hours trying to find out how to get rid of the 7th page to adhere to a 6-page format. So Scrum in practice, if you're a Scrum shop, you probably have a lot of inefficient time being spent adhering to Scrum. Now, a lot of shops that say they're Scrum aren't. They just get together and plan 2 weeks worth of work at a time and meet daily. They're not the full-on retrospectives and reviews and all of that. There's probably less inefficiency there, but even still, it's probably worth looking at your 2-week sprints and determining whether or not those are valuable in the long run. So when I've seen Scrum good, it's least like it's described in the guide. Essentially, people are using it for a way to get together and prioritize bodies of work in periods of time that deliver value frequently to customers. Some other frameworks. I didn't even blow up this picture, but this is the diagram for the SAFE framework. That is not a diagram that's focused on performance. That is a diagram focused on bureaucracy of some kind. I suppose if you were building like a nuclear launcher or something to where one mistake in the outcome and everything disappears, it's probably maybe useful. But even there's probably better ways to regulate the outcomes than something that looks like this, because it's a lot like a machine. Every new gear or moving part you introduce, the more likely something can break that you can't even find to fix. And candidly, this isn't completely just you can't figure out what's going on. It's nonsensical, even whenever you have been trained on it and try to put it into practice. Excuse me. So the Spotify model, even Spotify no longer uses it. But the question is, why is it theatrical? Well, it renamed a bunch of stuff for cool factor. Teams became squads, departments became tribes. It uses declaration as proxies for successfully achieving something. So for example, team autonomy was declared, but not achieved. And the model actually worked against autonomy. Spotify model adoption, it's most common where there's a belief that a framework named after a successful company will bring that company success. So similar to advertising, where everyone who uses the product is beautiful and in perfect shape, has a full head of hair, all of those things. I'm not going to get a full head of hair by changing what brand of jacket I buy. Principles greater than process. I have a couple minutes, so I'll kind of run through this quickly. The great thing about principles is they hold not only its scale, they grow in value. So the larger your company, the more valuable principles as the basis for how you work become, because it scales your decision-making almost as an operating system. One of the big challenges I see for a company as they grow is that people who were influential in the company's early success, that had great judgment, great experience, they were able to lead well, they stop being able to be in every meeting and part of every decision, and suddenly decisions veer wildly off track. If you train principles in the way of thinking in that approach, even when you're not in the room, decisions begin to get made similarly. Yet processes are really fragile and they change as a company grows. So what works for you when you're small, that process won't work later. Principles hold. Practice of principles can be reinforced through the right tools. Tools aren't processes, they're deployed as needed. Processes, less so. What are some principles that we actually like? Here are the principles that I would suggest for teams that want to move extremely quickly and be very effective. Empathy is more valuable than genius. So the great leadership that you're going to see that builds product that customers love is going to come from understanding them. Fall in love with problems, not solutions. Solutions tend to be a winner gets all outcome. You can't build everything, but if you have 7 people all working on the same problem, the value of that additional work is not just additive, it's often multiple. Execution is more valuable than vision. Fit is more valuable than consistency. So rather than trying to make everything the same, figure out what actually works in that moment. The more arbitrary the constraint, the less adherence it deserves. Use what works in practice, not what sounds best in theory. Processes are tools, they're not accomplishments. Use them when they're good, get rid of them when they're not. Customer outcomes are your only North Star. Also, work with what's true or can be made true, not with what you wish were true. That's a common mistake as well. Alignment is essential to execution, and speed matters. In some degree, I would say, so in your opinion, what percentage of teams operate on inefficient processes or principles? In some degree, all, including teams that I would run and manage today. But I would say those where it is very problematic and impacting their success, there it is, a majority. I've not been involved in enough to know, but I would say out of my experience, every single team that I run into has significant efficiency problems caused by processes that they have adopted that they believe are helping them. And Payten, I believe that was the time set aside.
Yeah, that's perfect. I actually had a couple follow-up questions, Tim, based on you calling out that all or a majority of teams tend to run on inefficient processes or principles to some degree. So as it relates then, in your experience, to managing junior talent or new talent, how do you like to approach bringing them into a new environment? I guess as a leader, yeah. How do you approach bringing junior or new talent into their first role, I guess?
Yeah, the first is to get, before we even talk about the processes or tools that we use, it really is a focused set of conversations around these principles. The fall in love with problems, not solutions, even though I have it second tier because I think it's slightly less important, it's the one that requires the most focus. Because I think it's just through life in general, when you watch movies and television and read about startups and successful businesses, it's so focused on the steps they took to achieve the outcome in the building, less around the understanding of customers. Like I think Creativity Inc. is a wonderful example that doesn't do that. That book is maybe my favorite book around thinking around like how do you build great things. But fall in love with problems, not solutions is a very early conversation. And then we talk around how do we find fit? How are we looking at customer outcomes as the North Star? It's only after that that I start breaking into some of the tools that we can use, like some of the scoring methods you can use to provide a consistent frame of language around these principles with one another. Process comes really, really late, if not, at least for me, I rarely even go into it in detail. We tend to fall into a natural cadence.
For you, if you think back at the beginning of your career, when you would have considered yourself junior or new in this space, did you find that it was difficult to change your habits or develop new ways of looking at things, even just adopting these new principles? What was that process like for you?
Yeah, I think so. Amazon was my shock treatment, like joining that company and watching how principles were leveraged there. I would say the first 30 days were me feeling a little bit stunned and overwhelmed. After that, it started to make sense. And within 90 days, it wasn't that there was mastery of how to do it, but the mindset shift was done. Like within about 90 days, it was like, okay, like I can actually grab these and apply them. And so it required some intentional effort then. It feels maybe more natural now, a little bit like riding a bike. Like at first it's terrifying, skin and knees. Then you get to where if you focus really hard, you only crash occasionally. And then eventually, you're doing silly stuff on the bike for fun, and the riding part is simple. It feels very similar.
I love how you focus on theatrics. What advice do you have for a leader listening or viewing this that might have had a moment when you were talking about it, like, oh, I do that? What advice do you give leaders that maybe have fallen into the habit of theatrics and are trying to take the next step and stepping out of that?
Yeah, I would say have courage and confidence. That you're Don't worry as much around the how it's going to feel to first acknowledge the inefficiency. And you'll see, I like analogies because they just help provide a frame of reference. But again, it reminds me if you've had a spending problem, there's that fear at first of like looking at your bank account because you have to acknowledge what you've done. But once you've done that, you can actually start getting a hold of it. And although it's often bad, it's rarely as bad as you think. It's often very solvable. Same thing. You're going to find the more scrutiny you apply, the more you're going to see it's going to hurt at first, but you can absolutely work through it. And I am absolutely certain after multiple experiences, your team will love that you've done this because they feel the inefficiency first and foremost. And they absolutely talk to themselves about how useless some of that time being spent is because they feel it every day in their work. So they will be appreciative.
That's great advice. Thank you. Tim, you're a wealth of knowledge. Your content is so valuable. Talk to us about where people can find you. Talk to us about what's up with you.
Yeah. So on a limited basis, I do work individually with companies. If you want to get in contact, you just use my personal email address. It's timothy.alvis@gmail.com. Can reach out there. Otherwise, I believe our plan is to host more of these and some
Great.
in-depth workshops together over the next period of time. But yeah, happy to discuss with anyone who's interested.
Great. We'll make sure to share that with the follow-up email of the recording, as well as the show notes. And that's exactly right. Tim will be joining us, lucky for us, at Coding Temple on a regular residency basis. So of course, we'll want folks to either reply to that email or let us know what content they're looking for, how they can tap into Tim's brain on these monthly basis that we have him here. So with that said, that brings us to the end of the show. A lot for people to noodle on. Thank you, Tim. Truly appreciate it. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you, Payten, and everyone who's here. Appreciate your time.
Bye.